Can you believe it? This is the last unit in the immunohematology course, Unit 15, Quality Assurance in the Transfusion Service. In your textbook, this is the first chapter, but my belief is that how do you know what is quality without having known about the testing and how to do the testing? So, beginning or end, I choose to teach this at the end. The history of regulation in blood bank goes back many, many, many years. And in the years before the HIV epidemic, blood banks were perceived as organizations that provided a community service. Increased occurrence of HIV and increased public scrutiny resulted in stricter FDA regulations. And this is a good thing, but it annoys me that the public thought the blood supply was 100% safe prior to HIV. It has never been safe. There's always the risk of acquiring a transfusion-transmitted disease, hepatitis B, hepatitis C, syphilis, to name just a few. But again, these were good things and brought to light some of the issues, especially in the screening process for donors. FDA regulatory oversight has resulted in an increased effort to provide a safe, high-quality product at a low cost, although I think low cost is a misnomer because of all the additional testing they do of the donor blood nowadays. Donor blood is not cheap. In the overview of quality assurance, the primary goal is transfusion of a safe unit of blood. What does that mean? One that will not transmit infectious diseases and is from a healthy donor who will give a boost, an appropriate boost, to the deficit for which we're transfusing for. To achieve quality, we must have well-constructed standard operating procedure manuals, well-trained personnel who carefully adhere to the SOPs. You do it without error. You don't skip a step. You don't add time. In blood bank, we are scrutinized very carefully about doing the procedures to the letter of the procedure. And then you have to have comprehensive guidelines which are in compliance with Joint Commission, the Food and Drug Administration, the American Association of Blood Banks, and the College of American Pathologists. So each of these is a type of regulatory agency, and they each serve different purposes. So we have to have a comprehensive guidelines that address all of these different agencies. Failure in the quality of blood collected, failure to screening of collected blood, or failure to follow procedures in transfusion protocols may result in fatal consequences. And my colleagues and I, we really have to struggle with whether to scare you to death and make you realize that if you do an error, there is the potential that a patient will die, or to perhaps minimize that risk so that you're not so afraid of blood banking. My choice is I want you to have a high level of knowledge of the consequences of if you do things improperly. Let's talk about the terms used in quality assurance. And there's so many Q's. There's quality assurance. There's total quality improvement. There's quality control. We're just quality to death. And I feel like sometimes half of my day is spent doing testing to justify that my results are accurate. Is that a bad thing? No. But sometimes it's annoying. So quality control is the management of the testing process itself. Monitoring of equipment and instruments. These have quarterly checks so that we know that the RPMs on our centrifuges are fine. We monitor our refrigerators religiously 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to make sure the temperature is not too cold or too warm. If they are, we have to move all of our blood products from that refrigerator to a refrigerator that is within the limits. Determining that reagents are reacting appropriately. Every day, the first thing you do when you sit down is quality control your reagents. No, you're not too busy. Because what if you did some testing on a patient and submitted those results, but it turns out your anti-A was giving false negative results? So again, quality control, just as in any other department, is done every day, first thing in the morning. And some areas of the lab will do it every shift. Quality assurance includes the entire process of providing patient care, from the time the physician orders the test until treatment of the patient based on the results of that test. Were appropriate lab tests ordered to determine the need for transfusion? And every hospital will have a transfusion committee that will review the transfusions, and they take all the data. If you're transfusing platelets, what was the platelet count? What was the justification for transfusing platelets? Because transfusion is not without risk, and so you have to weigh the benefits to the consequences. Did the transfusion service perform appropriate testing of patient specimen and preparation of the appropriate component? So again, this goes into proper recording. You record while those tubes or that gel is in your hand. Do not rely on your memory. And then, of course, the components. Was the appropriate component prepared for this patient? Was the transfusion administered properly? Did the two nurses go to the bedside and verify the identity of the patient against the information that's on the donor unit of blood? Did they take the pre-15-minute and post-vital signs? Did they check on the patient routinely to make sure a reaction was not occurring? And then finally, did the patient obtain the anticipated benefit? Well, the only way you're going to know this is by doing some post-transfusion testing. If it was a platelet transfusion, wait 4 to 6 hours, repeat the platelet count. And what you're expecting is a rise in the platelet count. Utilization review is the process of monitoring the appropriateness of transfusion. And again, this has to do with the committee. They will, again, review all the data and then determine if this transfusion was appropriate. If not, somebody on the committee will talk to the physician. There will be a written report. And continuous quality improvement, CQI. This involves reviewing the process of providing patient care with the goal of reducing rework, waste, and inappropriate care. So by going through all these different processes, if a problem is identified, then it's documented, an action plan is created, and then it's determined whether or not the issue was resolved by studying this issue again in the future. I call it the circle of life. Current good manufacturing practices, also known as CGMPs, are legal requirements established by the Food and Drug Administration. These regulations specify what needs to be done without specifying how it needs to be done. The CGMPs are only a part of the overall quality assurance program, and CGMPs primarily affect component preparation. That you have a FFP, you've thawed it, now it's liquid, and the CGMP has specific guidelines about documenting that process. Good manufacturing practices revolve around writing SOPs, which are standard operating procedures, that staff follow the SOPs and they're well trained. Record and document all work performed. In the laboratory, the mantra is, not recorded, not done. Well, I did it. I said, but you didn't record it. Well, I can record it now. No, you can't. The tubes aren't in your hand. You cannot rely on your memory to fill in documentation. Qualify personnel by training and education. One of our local hospitals has a 6-week boot camp, and depending upon your experience, if you are untrained, then you will go the full 6 weeks. If you have, like me, 20, 30 years experience working the bench, then they can shorten that for me. But again, it is critically important that you are watched every step of the way during the initial training and that you pass competencies. Yes, competencies never end. That's why we have so many of them in our training program, because this is what you will face when you go to the bench. Design and build proper facilities and equipment. I was involved, lab built a new lab, and it was so exciting to lay out the space and make sure it was appropriate, and the workflow and how we did things were in the correct orientation. Clean by following a housekeeping schedule. For you at the bench, you clean that bench when you arrive, and you clean that bench before you leave. You immediately clean up spills, you change your lab coat if it gets bloody, but that is one of the essential parts of protecting yourself from bloodborne diseases. Validate equipment, personnel, processes. Validating equipment is a pain in the you-know-what, because we have to, it depends what it is, whether it's a refrigerator, a centrifuge, whatever. We must follow a process to make sure that piece of equipment is operating correctly, as well as personnel, and that our processes. And there have been many times I believe in, don't go to your supervisor and be a whiny baby and say, this is a problem. You know what I did? I went to my supervisor. I said, this is a problem, and here's 2 or 3 solutions that I'm recommending to correct the problem. So be part of the corrective process instead of part of the problem. Perform preventive maintenance on facilities and equipment. In the blood bank, we don't have to do much validation. We have our biomed people come in and check the RPMs on our centrifuges, but preventive maintenance could be something as simple as making sure that, and I'm trying to think of one and I've kind of gone blank, that the refrigerators, we have to check their temperatures on a regular basis. Control for quality, and this is all aspects of the process, from collecting the patient's blood samples. What is a quality sample? What are you going to do if you receive a hemolyzed sample or a sample collected in the wrong tube, to QCing your reagents. Audit for compliance with all of the above. So periodically the supervisor will just pick a patient and look at the sample, look at the requisition, look at your testing, and do the audit. Was the QC done on the day of this testing? So they will check for all the processes involved all the way from the beginning to the end. And also, it starts with the doctor ordering. A quality assurance program comprises the combined activities performed by an organization, and this ensures the qualities of products and services offered. And it's not just about you. The nursing staff also have a role to play from the time they pick up that unit of blood or product to the end of the transfusion is also part of a quality assurance program. And we talked about the CGMPs, where from the beginning, when you are making a product into something else, if it's frozen, then you make it liquid, or if it's liquid and then you pool it, each of those steps requires following the CGMPs. Activities must be planned and documented by written policies and procedures. And the first day or days of your life will be spent reading the procedure manual. Now, it's hard to make sense. The one in our transfusion service was 2 4-inch binders. And every year we're required to review the procedure manual. And I look at it as a learning moment, because sometimes I'll reread procedures and say, oh man, I didn't realize that. Or maybe something changed. But it must be written policies and procedures which must be followed. So components of a quality assurance program in a blood center involves record keeping and standard operating procedures, because again, a blood center is totally different than a transfusion service. So their record keeping has all to do about donors. And then the personnel selection and training, all individuals have a set of training. I call it cookie cutter. We have the competencies which must be accomplished during the training in order for you to be set free to do your job. Or maybe the first 3 weeks is under supervision. Validation, calibration, preventive maintenance, proficiency testing. Yes, proficiency testing. Every laboratory that performs tests on humans and is CLIA, has a CLIA certificate must do proficiency testing. And this is provided by an outside agent that every quarter they send us unknown samples, and we must treat those samples just like we do patients. So if you run it through and the results are normal, you don't run it through again. And then what happens is you send your results in, and everybody who does proficiency testing through this company, there's just a few. They compare all the results, and that way they determine whether or not you are in compliance. So it's almost like competency testing, but on a broader scale. Supplier qualifications, you can only buy testing supplies from those that are blessed by the FDA. Error management, you have to have a plan. What if an error occurs? And then have an action plan. Process improvement, again, we're always looking to work smarter, not harder. What if we do this? That was the auto control in the transfusion service. It gave us no real value. And even if it was positive and the DAT was positive, it didn't change how we transfuse that patient. So why spend all these hundreds of thousands of dollars doing an auto control? So that's a process improvement. And process control. Be sure that you have a plan for controlling the process of what you do. What if a procedure is not working anymore? What if they've changed? Label control, hugely important in the donor center. And then internal auditing, just like in the hospital side, from the time a donor walks into the donor center until those components are fully processed, the documentation is done to make sure everything was done correctly. Record keeping. If it is not recorded, it never happened. And this is the most common violation. When I was laboratory director over a physician office lab, one of my primary complaints was record keeping for the temperatures. And so there was case days that sometimes the temperatures were not recorded. So I had to write up that as a violation. I spoke with the person who was responsible. We created an action plan, and finally, after a couple occurrences, we changed to one person who was, every day when they came in, they did the temperatures. But CLIA comes in, that's a violation. It's not a high-level violation, but if you have enough of those record-keeping errors, not recording controls, not recording this, that, and the other, yeah, they'll shut you down. Thorough record-keeping is essential. It recreates every step related to the production and distribution of blood components, including the individuals involved. Now, with computer systems, it's almost impossible not to put who was involved, because that in order to get into the computer, you have to log in. So your login will be associated with every result that you put in. This creates an audit trail which is necessary to investigate errors. For example, let's say a transfusion service gets a donor unit that was labeled Group O, but in fact it's AB. Well, we need to do an audit trail and find out where in the process the error occurred. Original data cannot be obliterated. You put a single line, your initials, and the correction. And in the computers, there's a different process to follow, but it still records that you made an error. And your supervisor, depending upon how big the transfusion service is, they will review the records either monthly or maybe weekly, and they'll track down if you make a lot of errors that had needed to be corrected, then an action plan needs to be developed. In a handwritten log, again, you cannot obliterate, scratch through, squiggle out the error. You have to one line so we can see what the original entry was, and then put the correction above it and initial it. Date and initial of changes is required. You are not allowed to use whiteout or pencil ever. And I get nervous when I see pencils. Hematology, they use pencils to label slides because it's a lot easier. It writes a very fine line. But and if if you do have an error, and I get nervous when I see whiteout in a department. You never white out incorrect results. In fact, there was a case, and I can't remember the specific details, but a person died because in the emergency room, either the wrong drug was given or the wrong dose. And what happened was the person responsible went back and whited out the incorrect and then wrote the correct, so it looked like the correct dosage had been given. Well, with forensics now, they were able to determine that the whiteout was there, and not only that, they were able to determine what was underneath. So again, no pencil, because it can be erased, and no whiteout. Document control is essential as it specifies and describes the media to be used. Is it handwritten? Is it electronic? Types of documents to keep, and the length of time. Everybody will have a document control. Even your records. There are certain records that after 2 years we're going to get rid of. Whereas there's other records that we will keep forever. So record keeping is so essential. I can't emphasize it enough that please be careful whenever you're recording your results. Audit trails are not just used for the transfusion service, they're also used throughout the lab. And this is a thorough record-keeping system that recreates every step related to production and distribution of a unit of blood. This step is known as an audit trail. An audit trail is important when investigating errors and accidents. The ability to trace back to the original entry and make corrections is also necessary in computer systems. But again, the audit trail is a very powerful tool when it's used correctly, even in situations when an error has not occurred. I know you can read this on your own, but this has some really good examples of good versus bad record keeping. So when we look, we're going to go back and forth. So good use of indelible permanent ink. Bad use of correction fluid or white tape, using a pencil or non-indelible, non-permanent ink. There are erasable inks. Good, recording data on an appropriate form or log. Bad, recording data on a piece of scratch paper or on your glove. It needs to go immediately into the patient's record, especially in blood bank. You have to have those tubes in your hands while you record your results. Good, recording the date and the initials of the person making the correction. Bad, not recording the date or the initials of the person making the correction, or recording data for someone else. You cannot leave your computer screen up and let someone else finish your work. Guess what happens if they make a mistake and the patient dies? That's on you. So never ever let somebody record data for you. Recording data immediately. Recording data later or not immediately following performance. You hold those tubes in your hands. You hold them up to your recording, above where you're going to record those results. And look at the tube, mark your result. Look at the tube, mark your result. And you can hold 4 or 5 tubes in your hand so that you can record them immediately. Do not rely on your memory. Good record keeping, not obliterating or deleting the original entry. Bad record keeping, obliterating or deleting the original entry when making a correction. This will get you fired. This will get you fired. That's dishonest, it's immoral, and absolutely against the rules. Take responsibility for your errors. I can't tell you how many times, and it's not a whole lot, I should say, but I've gone to my supervisor and said, hey, I screwed this up. I need to let you know I did this. And so she's not blindsided when she goes to review the results. She already has the explanation for why I did what I did. Indicating broken, closed, or not in use when appropriate. Not recording broken, closed, or not in use when appropriate. So if something breaks down, you need to immediately, every piece of equipment has some type of log form for maintenance. So if something's broken, you immediately log it into that sheet. Not using dittos, and bad is the use of dittos. Dittos, when you have, for example, the date and time are the same for a whole lot of results. Let's say you're working on 4 patients at a time. You cannot put them on the sheet and then put the date and time and then put the little quotation marks, which are the dittos, for each one all the way down. You have to write each result on its own. And when I went to check records at my lab, especially for the temperatures, having to record my initials and the date when I checked something all the way down, because I went in once a month. I would end up with little cramps in my hands by the time I was all done because they did not have a computer system. Document control is an essential process in the laboratory. Regulatory and accrediting agents expect documentation to be thorough, well organized, appropriately stored, usually in some flame-proof area, retrievable in a reasonable amount of time, protected from unauthorized access, modification procedure in place. So if you do need to change something, that there's a policy or procedure on how to do that, and destruction procedure in place. Again, I can't recall, and I should, I believe CLIA requires keeping patient records for 2 years. So I had folders and I put the date of when the documents needed to be destroyed, because especially if you're looking at paper, it takes up a lot of room. Electronics, they'll have a purge mechanism, but with electronics, since storage really isn't an issue, that they can retain records for a long time, but they still need to have a formal process of when destruction of documents take place, especially paper. Standard operating procedures, all record systems, including their control, handling, and disposal, must be thoroughly described in the SOP. So on the last page of the SOP, or maybe on the first page of the SOP, this needs to be documented. The SOP describes how a particular task is to be accomplished, and it's an important training tool for new employees. Not only for new employees, but what if it's a procedure you don't do all the time, like a Kleihauer-Becky stain? Then you'd want to pull out the procedure manual and refresh yourself. They are written using a standard format, so every procedure, no matter where you go and what department, should have the same organization. So I know where to find the principal, where I know where to find the references, I know where to find the reagents. They're all in the same order. For the most part, we've tried to model our procedures for your lab just like they would in a clinical lab. Ours will have a lot more detail because you are brand new. This is a new language. This is a new procedure. When you go to the bench, you'll notice that the principle, for example, or purpose, they may not be as extensive as ours, because you should know this stuff and they should be able to abbreviate it or consolidate it to where, even though it's brief, you understand. So principle, I can't tell you how important it is. What is reacting with what to give what type of reaction? You must know this. Otherwise, you're just a button pusher. Specimen requirements, not only acceptable, but unacceptable. What tube stopper color? Is hemolysis, and how much hemolysis may be acceptable? What about clotted samples? What about, so you have to define what is an acceptable sample, and maybe even tell what is not acceptable. The supplies, reagents, and equipment requirements for this particular procedure. Quality control requirements, very important. What do you do when you first start up your section of the lab? You do quality control. It's not if and or but. Oh, I'm so busy. No, that's not acceptable. It's done first. Calibration requirements. A lot of equipment in the lab must be calibrated, whether it's by the manufacturer of the equipment that they come in, or your biomed department, or you. Procedure instructions, step-by-step instructions on how to do this procedure. Interpretation and reporting. So you need to know what is a positive, what is a negative, so far as serological type testing, and then reporting. How do you report out the results? The acceptable values or results, this is much more important in the other areas where we have the values that are what used to be called normal values. Now they're called reference ranges. that a doctor or a healthcare provider will know that this result is in range or not. Procedure notes, maybe special things. Do not put this piece of equipment on a surface that vibrates, or keep it away from the sun, or there's just special procedural notes about this particular procedure. And then references. They have to have the references of where they got the information to write the procedure, whether it was the manufacturer's product insert or whether there's articles out there. So these are the suggested elements of a procedure. Change control, and we're specifically going to address the change control in the blood industry, which is in a constant state of change. We are challenged routinely by new technologies and regulatory and accrediting requirements. They keep adding different types of tests to the menu for donors so that we can prevent transfusion-transmitted diseases. Change control is time-consuming and requires money. However, the benefits do outweigh the costs, because if we can reduce transfusion-transmitted diseases by even a little bit, this is very important for the patient, because do we transfuse healthy patients? Absolutely not. We transfuse sick patients, and a disease that's transmitted through blood may put them over the edge and cause them to die. Change control ensures that nothing falls through the cracks. Areas of constant change in the blood bank is labeling. We have so many new products that can be created through the blood. Donor screening or criteria constantly changing. Component preparation methods, donor and patient test methodologies, equipment used, computer software and hardware. This is the end of Unit 15, Part 1. Again, be sure to review your textbook. They have a lot of other types of images, and the explanations are similar, but slightly different in some cases.